Hey everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the stories in this video, please leave a comment below. It really helps me out a lot and keeps me motivated to bring you more content. My roommate, who is male, and I, a female, lived in a small duplex house less than a block from the university. Our street was always busy with cars and people walking to and from campus, day and night. Although the town is small, the area where we live, which also includes the college, is often considered the bad part of town, likely because it's older and has more modest homes. There were a few homeless people around, but I got to know most of them when I worked at a fast food place, so I was familiar with the people who were thought to be shady in town. Before this situation, I had never felt unsafe in the 6 years I lived there. I often walked to work and school since I didn't have a car and had a lot of anxiety about driving. About 9 to 10 months ago, I was sitting in my living room around 10 p.m., relaxing and watching TV. My roommate was in his bedroom playing video games, as he usually did in the evenings. Earlier, I had ordered some pizza for dinner, but when it arrived, part of my order was missing. I called the pizza place to ask about the missing items, and they apologized, saying someone would be coming soon to deliver the rest of my order. While I was sitting in the living room, someone knocked very loudly on my door. It startled me, but I thought it was the pizza delivery person since I was expecting them. So, I went to answer the door. Now, I should also mention that there was no peephole, and I couldn't see who was outside from the window in the living room. The only option was to open the door. When I opened the door, there was a middle-aged man I didn't recognize standing on my porch. He was wearing a big puffy jacket, a black beanie, and large, heavy boots. It was dark, so I couldn't see his face clearly, and I was very shocked and confused. I said, "Hello." He took a small step back and asked, "Hey, is your husband home?" I was so confused that I didn't really think about my answer, so I said, "No." Then he said, "Oh, well, can you come outside and help me with something real quick?" That made me feel like I should get away from the situation. So, I told him to wait, closed and locked the door, and went to get my roommate. I explained what had happened, and he went outside to check, but the man had completely disappeared. It had been less than 5 minutes since I closed the door and went to get my roommate, so the man must have either run away quickly or left in a car. I felt a bit crazy because I was the only one who saw him, and my roommate hadn't seen him at all. He told me that I shouldn't answer the door late at night unless I knew who it was. I was really shaken up after this incident, so I called my boyfriend, crying, and told him what happened. He came over to make sure I was okay. Things went back to normal, but I was still very careful at night because I didn't want anything like that to happen again. Fast forward to mid-February. It was around 8 p.m., and I was sitting in my living room watching TV. I might have been waiting for food delivery again, but I don't remember for sure. Someone knocked loudly on my door once again. I was startled, but I went to answer the door. When I opened it, I was almost sure it was the same man from before, wearing the same clothes. He started asking if my husband was home, and I quickly slammed the door in his face, locked it, and got my roommate. By the time my roommate went outside, the man was gone again. At this point, I was absolutely terrified. The first time seemed like a fluke, just some weird person at my door, but when it happened again, I was really scared. My roommate and I debated whether to call the police, and I finally decided to do it. I called the non-emergency line, reported what happened, and a police officer came to my house. They took a description of the man and said they would keep an eye out for him. The officer asked me if I noticed anything specific about the man, like if he was hiding anything in his hand or if there was another car nearby, but I didn't see anything like that. I left a note in my neighbor's mailbox to warn her because I knew there was a girl around my age living there, and I wanted to make sure she was safe. Nothing like that happened again before I moved out, but it really stayed with me and still makes me nervous today. Now, I'm very careful whenever I leave my house, even during the day. This took place about 10 years ago in the south of the UK. I'm 28 now, but at the time, I was around 18, working part-time at a gas station on a road that connected a small, quiet village to a larger highway leading to a nearby city. The village itself was really nice and one of those places where only wealthy people could afford to live. It was mostly residential, with big houses, well-kept gardens, and expensive cars. There weren't many shops, and the only big one was a Waitrose, which shows how high-end the area was. Everything else in the village was either small boutiques or privately owned fancy grocery stores. Since I've always liked cars, it was fun to see the different luxury sports cars parked outside each day. This is where I met Michael. He was in his late 40s, had dark hair, and dressed well. Michael always wore Gant or Ralph Lauren, and on workdays, he'd be in tailored Canali suits. He was a really nice guy, always very polite, which was rare because most people in the area treated others badly if they weren't as well off. Michael stood out because he didn't act that way. We often had casual conversations about his car collection or the expensive watches he wore. Michael would always show up wearing a Rolex and driving either his Aston Martin, Range Rover, or Porsche, so we always had something to talk about. I found out he worked in finance, and we talked about my plans for the future, as I also wanted to work in finance. We had many friendly conversations until I left that part-time job to start an apprenticeship at my uncle's brokerage. Now let me tell you about my uncle. He's involved in a lot of different businesses. Besides his brokerage and property portfolio, he also owned a few takeaway places for extra cash flow. Sometimes, I would help out as a delivery driver when one of his drivers didn't show up. It was a bit of extra work, but I didn't mind. Fortunately, my uncle lived in the same village I mentioned earlier, and the main pizza place he owned was popular with the locals. Because of this, tips were usually quite generous, and my uncle often gave me a little extra money for helping out. In the summer of 2008, I was asked to deliver a few pizzas to a house on an especially prestigious road. This area was known for its grand homes and was a key spot for high-profile residents. The average house price here was over £1.4 million, and I was curious to see what these homes looked like up close. They were all gated and set far back from the road, hidden behind trees and bushes. I found the place and pressed the intercom. A muffled voice came back, saying, "Yes." I replied with the name of the takeaway, and the gates slowly opened. I drove up the long driveway to a huge mock Georgian house with a separate garage for 4 cars. That's when I noticed Michael's number plates on one of the cars. His cars had personalized number plates with his initials and the numbers 1, 2, and 3. His wife's cars had the same style. As a young person wanting to work in finance, I was really interested to see how this guy lived. I got out of my car, took the pizzas, and when the double doors opened, I saw a face I didn't recognize looking back at me. It was a young man, maybe in his early 20s, thin, with a shaved head. He wasn't wearing a shirt and had on some old, worn jeans and sneakers. He was also holding something behind his back, though I couldn't see what it was. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse and barely audible, with an accent I'd never heard before. He told me to bring the pizzas to the kitchen. I noticed the house was very quiet inside, and the decor was as impressive as the outside of the home. Feeling a bit nervous, I didn't say anything and just stared at him, which seemed to make him more upset. "Bring the pizza through," he said again, sounding more aggressive. Finally, I spoke up and asked, "Where's Michael?" "This is Michael's place, right?" Now, it's really true that in situations like this, your mouth can go dry, and it's always best to trust your instincts. This guy was making me feel extremely uneasy, and every part of me was screaming to get out of there. But then I realized I was trapped inside because it was a gated property. My heart started racing, and I felt a wave of terror as panic took over. I dropped the pizza on the gravel, left my car, and decided I'd have a better chance of getting away by running down the driveway and climbing over the gates. They were wooden and didn't have sharp spikes on top. All the while, I could hear his footsteps crunching on the gravel behind me. I didn't look back and managed to climb over the gates, landing on the pavement below with a thud. My heart was racing, and the adrenaline kept me running fast for what felt like hours, but it was probably just 10 minutes. I made my way to a nearby park and, feeling safe enough to stop, called the police. One officer stayed with me to keep me calm and take my statement, while the other drove to the property with another patrol car to investigate. At first, I felt like the police didn't believe me or thought I was involved in something. But when my uncle arrived to pick me up and confirmed that I was there to deliver pizza, the officer started to believe me. When they got to the property, they didn't find anyone there. However, they did find my car with slashed tires and broken windows. I later found out that Michael and his family were visiting relatives in Australia at the time. I never went back for another shift at the pizza place. Wealth and financial security can be just an illusion. People are still people, and there are some disturbed individuals who will always find ways to act out their twisted behavior. I usually like to explore on my own, especially when it comes to hiking. My friends aren't very active, and when they join me, they tend to move at a slower pace, which holds me back. One Saturday afternoon, around 2 p.m., I decided to head out on a hike by myself. The trail I chose was one I had hiked many times before, but only in the early morning when the air is cool, and the path is quiet. Knowing how long the trail was, I figured I'd finish just around sunset. The trail is about 9 miles round trip and has a steady uphill climb on the way back, which makes it a bit challenging. The first half of the trail goes through a dense forest where the trees create a cool, shaded path. The second half of the trail moves along an open mountainside where you get wide views and more direct sunlight. Even with the sun high in the sky, the thick treetops of the forest blocked most of the light. As I began hiking, I passed a few hikers who were on their way back. Seeing them made me realize that I was one of the last few still on the trail. The thought of being out there alone as it got darker pushed me to walk faster, making sure I'd finish before sunset. Everything went smoothly as I hiked, moving quickly along the trail. I reached the end, took a short 5-minute break, and then started heading back. By the time I was halfway back, it was around 4 p.m. The trail was quiet, and I didn't see anyone else because I had already passed a few people who had turned around earlier. I was completely alone on the way back. The sun was starting to disappear behind the mountains, making the forest even darker. As I climbed the steep part of the trail, the shadows grew longer, and the trees seemed to close in around me. Feeling a bit uneasy being alone, I turned on my music to help keep my mind off the growing darkness. As I was walking, I saw a dark shape, maybe the size of a rabbit or skunk, run across the trail. It didn't look like any animal I knew because it was too fast and didn't have a clear color or shape, just a dark blur. It startled me, so I started jogging. The light kept fading, and it was getting darker every moment. As I jogged, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following me, even though I knew no one was behind me. The trail had been empty the whole way back. To stay prepared, I took out my pocket knife, which I always carry just in case I need it for protection. Halfway through the forest, I started to feel worn out from jogging, so I slowed to a fast-paced walk. As I slowed down, I felt a strong urge to look back. I checked over my shoulder a few times but didn't see anything. I kept a fast pace for about half a mile and was getting close to the trailhead. When I looked back again, I saw a dark, human-shaped figure following me about 30 feet behind. The dark figure had a clear head and upper body, but below the waist, it was just a dark blur. As soon as I noticed it, the figure suddenly dashed into the trees. Scared out of my mind, I sprinted toward the trailhead. Luckily, I was closer to it than I thought, and I was incredibly relieved to finally see the sunlight and my car. I ran so fast to my car that I didn't see the people still in the parking area preparing to leave. It wasn't until I was safely inside my car, shaking and trying to calm down, that I noticed them. I took a few moments to collect myself, breathing deeply and trying to steady my nerves before I drove away. I haven't gone hiking since that day. It's been 2 months. I did some research on the trail and found out it was used in the late 1800s to travel between gold mining towns. It was forgotten for almost 100 years until it was reopened in the 1980s for recreation and to reach a swimming hole. I work as a delivery driver for a small burger joint in a quiet suburban area. The town is nothing special, just rows of houses, some local shops, and a forest that hugs the outskirts. It's the kind of place where most people know each other, so when a stranger comes around, it doesn't go unnoticed. My shift last Thursday started like any other. Orders came in steadily through the dinner rush, and I handled them without issue. It wasn't until the clock crept past 9 p.m. that things got strange. I had just returned to the restaurant to grab my next delivery, a single burger and fries to a house I didn't recognize on the edge of town. The address wasn't in our usual delivery range, but since it wasn't too far out, my manager told me to take it. I loaded the order into my insulated bag, hopped into my car, and headed off. The GPS guided me to a narrow, winding road surrounded by dense woods. The further I drove, the darker it got. My headlights struggled to cut through the thick trees, and the road became rough and uneven, with no streetlights in sight. I glanced at my phone's map again. The house was only a few minutes away, so I pushed on. When I finally arrived, I almost thought I'd made a mistake. The house was ancient, 2 stories tall, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. It looked abandoned, but a dim light flickered from inside. I parked in the gravel driveway, took a deep breath, and grabbed the bag. As I approached the front porch, the boards creaked loudly under my weight. I knocked on the door, and it echoed in the silence. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no movement. Then, I heard slow, heavy footsteps approaching from inside. The door opened just enough for me to see a hand, thin, pale, and almost skeletal, reaching out to grab the bag. A raspy voice whispered, "Thank you," before the door slammed shut. I stood there for a second, uneasy, before quickly heading back to my car. As I pulled out of the driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The woods seemed alive, shadows shifting just beyond the reach of my headlights. On my way back to the restaurant, my phone buzzed. Another order popped up, this time for a house on the same road. I groaned, annoyed that I had to go back, but it was part of the job. The name on the order was the same as the previous one, which struck me as odd. When I arrived at the address, I was stunned. It was the same house. Confused, I checked the app again, but there was no mistake. The order was for another burger and fries, and the timestamp showed it was placed only minutes after I had left. Reluctantly, I grabbed the bag and walked back to the porch. This time, before I could knock, the door creaked open. The pale hand was there again, waiting. I handed over the bag, and the same raspy voice whispered, "Thank you." I turned to leave but stopped when I heard a faint, childlike giggle coming from inside the house. It sent chills down my spine, and I hurried back to my car. As I drove away, the unease grew stronger. My phone buzzed again. Another order. Same name. Same address. I didn't want to go back, but my manager insisted. "Just take it," he said. "It's probably some glitch in the system." This time, as I approached the house, I noticed something different. The light inside was no longer dim, it was blazing, illuminating the overgrown yard. The front door was wide open, and I could see the silhouette of someone standing just inside. When I stepped onto the porch, the figure disappeared into the darkness of the house. I set the bag down and turned to leave, but before I could, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The giggle I had heard earlier erupted into loud, manic laughter. It echoed through the woods, growing louder and more distorted. Panicked, I sprinted back to my car and peeled out of the driveway, gravel flying. As I sped down the road, my headlights caught something in the rearview mirror. A figure was standing in the middle of the road, holding the delivery bag. Their face was obscured, but I could see something glinting in their hand, something sharp. When I got back to the restaurant, I quit on the spot. My manager thought I was overreacting, but I knew what I had seen. It's been a week since that night, and I still can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see that house, that figure, and the glint of the blade. I've checked the address on Google Maps, but it doesn't exist. The scariest part? Every night at 9 p.m., I get a notification on my phone for a new order. Same name. Same address.